Okay, so now that we can loop over a certain range of data, the last thing we need to cover is how to save this data out to a file on our computer, because it's all well and good to kind of loop through this and print it out to test it, but what we really want to do is be able to store that data and reuse it later. And Python is very flexible with writing to files. It can write to a number of files, but in our case we're just going to stick to really basic text files, and we're going to use a standard delimited format for writing data tables into text files. If you don't know what the delimited format is, it's typically saved as a .csv, which stands for comma separated values, and in the format you generally just use a specific character to separate columns. So each row becomes a row of data, and each column, like you would have in Excel, is separated by a specific character. With a CSV, it's a comma, but you can use actually any character. So just to show you this, I'm going to make a really generic kind of text file. So here I'm just going to go to text document. I'll call this data.txt. So this is a blank document now. And now in this text file, I'm going to write some data manually using a delimiter. So here I might have name, and I'm going to use a semicolon here, age, and city. And then every time I hit return, it's going to create a new row, right? Here I'll have Bob, 16, New York City, John, 23, Chicago. So you can see this is just base text, right? But because I'm using these delimiters, you can actually open it up in software like Excel, and it converts it to a table format. So I hit save. Now if I actually open Excel, I can go to data from text. And if I find that piece of text, I can import it, and now Excel will ask us how that data is formatted. So here you see brought in every row, but it still doesn't know that we want to separate by these things. What we want to do is specify delimited up here, hit next, and then tell Excel what our delimiters are, how we're separating this data into columns. You can specify any number of these. Tabs are a typical one. I don't like to use tabs because they're kind of harder to encode with Python. Also, I don't like to use commas because when we get into a lot of this text, it actually has commas in the data itself. So commas often separate numbers. Also in comments, like in Weibo, a lot of people use commas and spaces. So I found that the semicolon works pretty well for this data. So once we specify the semicolon, you can see that's already broken up into these columns. If we hit finish, okay, now we have this data set. So there are libraries in Python which you can write directly to an Excel file, but they tend to be overly complicated for what we actually want to do. So the easiest way to output data is actually just to use Python to write these kind of strings that are separated by these specific characters, and then output them to a basic .txt file, which we can then open up in GIS and in Excel. Okay, so we're going to go back to Python, and I'm just going to quickly start a new document to show you the basics of how writing to files work. And this is really simple, but there's a few things that you have to pay attention to. Okay, so to write a file, Python has to connect to some part of your hard drive to know where to write or access these files. And if you go to your File Explorer, you have this address bar up here, and a lot of times this will be shortened somehow to make it easier to read. But if you click on the address, it will actually give you the full address into your file system. And this works for Windows. In Mac, there's a similar thing in the Explorer, but I think the address bar is actually on the bottom. Okay, so I can actually copy this whole address, and in Python, I'm gonna say working directory. This is a common variable I use to specify locations on my file system. And I'm going to do open quote and paste that in, close quote. One particular thing about Python and Windows, and this might change a bit for Mac, so you should kind of try this out and see what works, is you have to double up on these backslashes. And this is because the backslash in Python means something very specific. To make it work as a backslash in text, you actually have to use two of them. It's just something you have to remember. Okay, so here is my address for where I want to keep my new file. And this will change for your system. And to write to a file, you actually have to write not just the address, but also the name of the file itself. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to keep this variable as my directory. I'm going to add a set of backslashes here, and then to that I'm just going to add on my actual file name. So I'm going to say file name equals working directory plus the name I want to use for my file, which I'll just say test.txt. Okay, so this is a standard way I do this. You can also just add this directly to here, but because you often reuse the directories, separating it out is really helpful, because the next time I want to create a new file, all I have to do is replace this bit. I don't have to write out the full directory each time. That's why I call it the working directory, because I'll reuse it many times. Okay, so now to write to a file, you basically have to open a file for writing. And that's pretty easy to do. We just create a variable to keep the file reference. So I typically use F. And now I'll say open. So this is similar to the function we used to open HTML files for reading. But now I'm just going to use the open function itself. And inside the open function, I need to specify the name of the file. So this is the file that I specified here. It doesn't exist yet, but the open operation will actually create that file, create a new file for writing. And here I have to specify the way that I want to open that file. And in this class, we'll mainly use WB when we want to write to a file. That stands for write binary. Or RB when we just want to read from it, and that's stands for read binary. And the reason we use read instead of write is just to protect the file, to make sure that we can't overwrite it by accident. Okay, so now the file is open. We can start writing any number of lines to the file, and we do that with the write function. And we first use the file variable that's storing the reference to the file, and then we can use the write function on that file. And here we'll just put in test. So this can be any string. It'll actually write it as a piece of text in a file. Okay, so this will already write some information to the file, but before this information is stored, you have to actually close the file. And you can think of closing the file as equivalent to saving. You know, if you're editing a file, you have to save before you quit. It's the same thing here. If you end the program without closing the file, it actually won't save any of your changes. This is super important. And to do that, we just use the close function on that file. So if we run this, you know, it's run that operation. If we go back to our folder, you can see our file here, and it's written our text. Okay, so that's all there is to it. And now we can go back to our demo and integrate those file writing functions into it, so we can actually write out all of this data.